Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm so excited to be here today with my good friend, Rudra Chatterjee, who is the chairman of Luxmi Tea, and we're going to talk about the tea industry. Rudra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will. Good to be back.
So, Rudra, thank you so much for coming on today to give us just an overview of the tea industry. I'm really interested in this, sector of the agricultural industry. Maybe you could start by just kind of giving us a broad overview of the entire value chain of tea, and then we can do a bit more of a deep dive on production. But just from production all the way to my cup of tea in the United States, let's say, what are all the different stages of the value chain?
Sure. So tea grows mostly in China, India, Sri Lanka, and Africa. And the two big varieties, it's green tea and black tea. Both grow from the plant, Camellia sinensis, which can have an Assam variety or a Chinese variety. This tea is harvested either in small estates or in large estates. And then, depending on the kind of tea you drink, it's processed into green tea, which is not oxidized. So it's either steamed or fried, or oxidized, which is black tea. So that tea being produced then goes mostly to the auctions in Calcutta, in Mombasa, in Colombo, by packaging companies. The largest are Lipton and Twinings, and then brought to the supermarket shelves in the United States. That has been the traditional way tea has been sold over 100.
Okay, so a few questions here. Green tea and black tea, so that can come from the same plant, picked at the same time, but it's just different ways that you treat the leaves?
That's right.
Okay, and just so I understand some of the basics here, Assam and Chinese tea, those are like different sub varieties of the tea plant. So those are actually like different plants.
That's right.
All right.
It's same family but different plants.
Okay. Talk to me about what do we mean by a tea estate? Talk to me about the actual production process of tea. Who is doing the work? What's the annual cycle like? Is it harvested all at once or continuously? Just walk me through the life of a tea estate.
Sure. So the tea estate is actually a British concept. When the British were importing tea from China, it cost them so much money that they were going bankrupt. So they had to figure out a way to pay for the tea. So the first thing they tried to do was grow opium in India and get the Chinese hooked onto opium and use the proceeds of that money to buy tea from China. That obviously wasn't something that the Chinese people liked for very long, and that caused the Opium War between England and China. That's how Hong Kong came to Britain. But at that time, there were some people in India who were working in the botanical gardens, British people, of who Robert Bruce was the most famous one, who wondered whether, since Britain had already colonized India, whether they could grow the tea in India instead of, selling opium and fighting battles or going bankrupt in the process. So that's how they started producing tea commercially in India. To do that, they went and annexed Assam, the territory which produces tea, and cleared out massive forests. Assam had very few people at that time. So they brought the tea workers from another part of India and stole Chinese tea bushes and planted it in Assam. So along with the Assamese variety, there was the Chinese variety. So to do all of that, they basically had to have a big commercial process, and that's where an estate started, rather than having small farms in the way the Chinese or the Japanese would go to. So the Indian tea farms tends to be much larger than the Chinese tea farms. So usually, 1,000 hectares or 2,000 hectares, and the same is true for Africa, where the tea farms in Kenya or Rwanda or Malawi, these are large farms because these were basically done by Europeans. They weren't part of the African tradition or the Indian tradition. So the estate today works with a factory which processes the tea, and large land which has roughly 15,000 tea bushes per hectare, which tend to be plucked on a cycle of once a week. If we are in India, where it's seasonal, so during the dry season or the winter season, you won't be getting the tea growing. So the tea growing period starts from March and ends in November. The best teas are grown during the first flush, which is in March, and the second flush, which is towards the end of May or June. But in Africa, because you're on the equator, there's no such difference. Every day is a good day to produce tea. If there tends to be, even at the equator, some dry months where the tea production is slightly lower, but big variability that you see in India does not exist in Africa. So that's how tea is produced in an estate. What comes out of an estate is fully produced black or green tea, usually then sent to auction centers. So teas in Assam and Darjeeling would be sent to Calcutta, and teas in Africa would be sent to Mombasa, and that's where people would send out samples to buyers. You would have, in the past, it used to be public outcry. Now it's e-auction, and people would buy lots of teas.
Talk to me about the organization of a tea estate. So maybe come up with a prototypical example of a tea estate. How many people are there? How are they organized? What are the different divisions or departments or roles? And how is it governed?
So in terms of the pluckers in the tea estate, the people who pluck the tea, there tends to be between 2 to 3 pluckers per hectare. Depending on which country you're in, the pluckers might be living in the estate and they're fully employed by the estate, or they might be villagers who come, pluck, earn money, and go back to their village. That differs from place to place, but in the original British territories, like I explained in Assam, there were very few people in Assam. So pluckers actually had to have housing created for them within the estate where they would live. So in a tea estate, which is 1,000 hectares, you would typically have 2,000 people plucking tea. And they would be also the people who would be planting the tea, uprooting the tea, planting the shade trees, which, in a tea estate in Assam, because it gets hot in June, you have trees mainly for shade, so that it doesn't burn the leaves. So all of that work are done by this massive pool of people. So this, because these places are remote, even now, you would have to have schools for the workers. You would have hospitals, and you would basically have, everything that they would need. Clubs, worker clubs. They would, have rotating work during winter. There would be pruning during summer, and during the rest of the year there would be plucking. The management of the tea estate, again, it is a British, almost mirrors the army. In fact, many of the managers in a tea estate used to be people who were in the army. And so you had the manager would be the senior most. Below who there would be field and factory assistants. And to be a manager, you would usually have to spend um, 20 years on the job, out of which 10 years would be as assistant manager. And below assistant manager, they have um, what are usually called sardars or JCO. Again, JCO is an army term in British Army. And so the sardars would actually work directly with the pluckers or the factory. So the manager would usually start his day at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And that would continue till, and that will be at the field, and usually come later in the afternoon to see the factory. The factory process starts with the leaves coming in, which usually should be 1 week old. So leaves are plucked every week. So the 7 days growth of leaves would be plucked, and it will come in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it will wither. So when you put it on uh, like large, 100 feet long, 6 feet wide leaf houses, where you would introduce dry air to take away about half the moisture, or 60% of the moisture from the leaf. Once the tea is withered, which takes a few hours, you would first, depending on the kind of tea you want, either cut the leaves or you would just put the leaves into to make orthodox teas, which are whole leaf teas, and then you would put it in a dryer and then sort the teas. It's a simple process that hasn't changed over years, but that's the factory, the work at the factory.
So you're drying these leaves, and it sounds like they're out there effectively plucking every day, and they kind of rotate around their hectare. And by the end of the week, they're at the beginning again. So you're constantly plucking. So these plants are kind of like sort of like evergreen type plants. They just bear leaves year round. It's not like a deciduous, maple tree or something that loses all its leaves in the northern
So the
hemisphere.
tea plant doesn't lose its leaves. It stops growing new leaves in winter if you're in Assam or Darjeeling. It doesn't stop doing that in Africa. It grows through the year. Equatorial Africa. And in terms of the quality changes through the year. The kind of tea that you would get at different times of the year, depending on the rainfall, depending on the soil. There's big variation. I don't think there's any beverage with the kind of breadth that tea has. In terms of the tea bushes are actually in a bonsai plant, because it's all pruned to be at plucking height. So the tea bushes would usually grow taller than a human being. It's 7 feet or higher, but it's pruned every 3 years, and you keep it at a height which is plucking height, around 3 feet.
Now, what are some of the degrees of freedom that a manager or an owner of an estate can use to get increased value from the estate with a long-term perspective? So I think you and I have had conversations before about also monetizing the lumber perhaps from the shade trees, or are there ways to increase production, or are there some estates that might pluck too much or not invest in planting new plants? So as a manager or owner, what are some of the decisions that you make or degrees of freedom to increase the long-term value?
So first is to ensure that the culture in any organization, you visited tea estate, Will, and both of us used to be management consultants. One of the best trainings for a manager is in the tea estate, because you first create a good culture where the people who are working in the estates, whether they are at the factory, who need engineering skills and focus on quality, and at the field where you have to make sure that so many people are, uh, coming on time with discipline, but they're well looked after, and their health and their well-being is a priority. You have to have people with both discipline and compassion, and then you have to focus on quality. That means that you do pluck the leaves every 7 days, because you can let the leaves grow and actually you get a much higher crop by leaving the leaves on the bush for 9 days or 10 days, because the bush actually gets into a faster growth spurt after this, between the 7th to 9th day, but it drops the quality. So you have to make a choice between quality and volume, and then you have to essentially focus on who are you making the tea for. One of the historical issues with the tea industry has been that the producer in the tea estate never know who the buyer is. So if you do not know how the buyer likes drinking the tea, so it's just the job ends with the production of the tea and then it's auction. So, but in an environment where who the buyer is, and the buyer knows how the tea is produced, you can actually do a lot more in terms of making it more customized to buyers' needs. Like in some ways, wines are, or olive oils are. People really promote one character of a vineyard, one character of the season, of the growth, of the terroir. That is something that tea is equally capable of doing, but the business model has been different, because and that's equally true for coffee, where the producer does not really have an occasion to understand what the buyer wants. And that's why I'm very excited, because it was uh, during the lockdown, during COVID, when people weren't stepping out of home, we innovated and starting selling these teas directly from our tea estates online. And we started getting emails and feedback from buyers about how they like the tea, and what they liked about the tea. And for the managers in the tea estate, for the workers in the tea estate, this was a revelation, because this is the first time in history that they heard from final consumers.
And let's just take a moment here. If people are interested in sampling your teas, you want to give some links of where they can go?
Sure. I'll send you the website. We have Luxmi Tea is our company. So luxmitea.in is the website, because it's mostly produced in India, although it also carries our Rwandan teas. And we have a tea estate which produces probably the most famous tea in the world, called Makaibari. And makaibari.com is another website. One can come and buy just one package of tea or a package of tea bags, but you can also subscribe to the teas, where you would get enough for 2 people every day of the month, and you can subscribe for a year. So that's delivered anywhere in the world, including in the United States.
Okay, and I'll just repeat that. So Luxmi luxmitea.in, and that's luxmitea.in, and we'll include that link in the show notes, as well as Makaibari, MAKAIBARI.com. So we'll include those links in the show notes. So one thing that I think you told me in the past that's kind of interesting or a bit different about the tea industry is along the lines of what you're saying, is how the workers, the pluckers, will actually be living on the estate, that the workers may have a truly long-term perspective in mind compared to some workers at maybe a manufacturing plant, because they were maybe even born there, raised there, and their children, they may expect to have their children working on the same estate. So in some ways, they may have a very long-term perspective of wanting to make sure that they're, planting and really taking care of the tea plants because it's their future as well. Could you comment on that a little bit about how the owner and the workers kind of
Sure. In fact, there are different formats. In Africa, where we have tea estates in Rwanda, the workers actually own the land. So in Rwanda, we would have much larger blocks of tea estate where the company land is called the industrial block. And that would be 200 acres. And the farmers would have their own land, which would be 1,000 acres. All of this land comes into the factory. All of the tea from this land comes into the factory. But when we make the tea, when we produce the tea, we have a revenue share. In some places it's 60%, some places 50%, depending on which country. So in Rwanda, it's half the revenue goes to the farmer. So if someone is buying tea at $4 a kg, $2 would go to the farmer. And $2 would come to the factory and to the management. So the farmers own the land in Africa. In that case, it's actually easier to maintain quality because they see that every time that they're making better leaf, the tea prices are higher. And we usually get very good quality in setup where the farmer actually owns the land. In areas where it is 100% industrial block and the farmers don't own the land, there too, the farmers are working there for generations. And the best way to involve the farmers is because they actually know enough about tea processing themselves. The best way to involve the farmers is to give, along with the farmers working in the tea estate, give them a good education so that you can start having the Sardars, the JCOs, and eventually some managers coming from the farmers. That was never the case in the past. It was always, ex-army people or people who studied in what used to be called public school education in Britain. They would come from a completely different environment, and it was like a big difference in the social background of the manager and the farmer. But that is changing, and I think that's great for quality. As in when you can have the farmers and the managers from the same cadre, not all the time, but more and more. I think that also gives an opportunity to all the people and the farmers to say that this is a great way for me to develop, for my children to develop.
Talk to me a little bit about difference in tea consumption and or demand for quality with different countries. Are there some countries that have like a much higher level of sophistication and demand for the highest quality teas? Which ones are those? And which countries are somewhat ignorant and just get the lowest quality, bottom of the barrel type stuff?
So the highest quality teas, personally speaking, from Luxmi are typically bought by Japan. And in fact, the first flush teas which are being plucked now, 100% of it goes to Japan.
No kidding.
And it's different times the Japanese emperor has purchased teas from Makai Bari. Also, good quality teas tend to be bought by Germany. Germany often buys very good teas. Britain has both very good and very bad teas. It's got a big mix of high quality and poor quality teas. Unfortunately, so far, US doesn't have a great record of high quality teas. It tends to buy teas from supermarkets, massive packaging, and not great quality. But that is changing because more and more people are becoming much more involved with the beverages that they drink. And we are seeing many, there's a tea company called Smith Tea. Steve Smith has started it. He started Tazo and sold it to Starbucks. Many teas in US. There's Sebastian Beckwith in Pursuit of Tea in New York. Many hotels have very good tea sommeliers. So that's changing. But traditionally, US used to have uh, many old tea houses, but with good branded teas. But it went away and it's coming back.
Yeah. Give us a sense of the kind of the range of price, maybe at the wholesale level of like the best quality teas in the world versus the more commodity level of what kind of range we see.
There are some extreme numbers, like Makai Berry sold at $1,850 for 1 kg. That's a crazy number, but that's it's never going to show up in wholesale. An average Makai Berry produce would be like $100, $50 to $100 a kilogram. Now, while that sounds very high, I'll just put this in perspective that one teaspoon has 2 grams or 2.5 grams of tea.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 500 cups of tea, 400 to 500 cups of tea. So if you're buying teas that are $100, which are some of the most expensive teas that you would be buying, it'd still be 20 cents for 1 cup of tea. So it's not a lot of money compared to many other things that you might be buying, and it's certainly a much better drink than many other more expensive beverages that you would be buying.
Well, compared to the highest end wines, for example, we're talking a much different price.
Or even in a can of Coke.
Yeah.
It's much cheaper than a can of Coke, or or a bottle of bottled water.
Yeah, and that would be $50 to $100. That would be at the wholesale price or at the retail price.
So if you look at the teas that Makai Berry sells online, that's around the price, $50 a kilogram, $12 for 250 grams. Mm-hmm. And also $7, $8 for the Assam teas. So that comes to around $30 or so for a kilogram. Yeah. So that would be 15 cents for 1 cup of tea. So that's for us, it's the same from manufacturing to retail. But I think typically what happens is, like in every product, if it goes through various categories, auction, and then wholesale, then packaging, then supermarket, then customer, you might find that the price of tea is what gets discounted, because there's people, I think, mistakenly feel that customers don't appreciate good quality tea. Yeah. I've always found that to be wrong. What happens is, if you give people good tea, they tend to drink 2 or 3 cups. And if you give them a bad cup of tea, they just say, okay, I don't understand tea. But they do understand it is bad tea. That's why they say they don't understand tea. Yeah. And they just don't finish, they at most have 1 cup or none at all.
So what would some of your guidelines be if you're not really a sophisticated tea drinker and haven't experienced really good quality tea? What are some sort of tips? Like if I would sort of have this impression that kind of tea bags are maybe a lower end tea, and you want to be looking for whole leaf tea. But talk about freshness, like how you think about tea and you say, oh, well, it's dry, it should last forever. But how important is freshness? What are the things you should look for? How do you know if you're getting a good quality cup of tea?
So it is true that tea is dry and it should last for a long time. But what happens with tea is it's very hygroscopic, which it picks up smells from around the kitchen or wherever it was. So it's important that you store the tea in a dry and away from other very smelly or spicy things that you might have in the kitchen, because it's happened to me many times that when I'm tasting teas, I'm tasting fruits, and I realized that it was in the same truck that the fruits and the tea had come. So during mango season in India, the teas might start smelling of mangoes. So, but when you're buying tea, I think it's a good investment to buy a teapot. And if you have the time to brew the tea yourself in a teapot, it's very easy. The teaspoon is called a teaspoon because it makes 1 cup of tea. So you just put 1 teaspoon of tea. You can do that with black tea or green tea, or if you like tea with some natural flavors, you just put that into the pot, and ideally the pot you should just pour some hot water into the pot before you pour the tea.
Before the tea.
Before you pour the tea, you just put some hot water, warm the pot, throw away the hot water, and then pour the tea leaves and then the hot water, and let it brew for 3 to 5 minutes. And it's very easy. It's making a cup of tea for yourself. I think for me, it's a great ritual. It takes 10 minutes maximum. I do it the first thing in the morning, and and also the first thing I do when I come back from work.
Yeah.
So it's a very nice social thing to do. You can make 2 cups of tea. If 2 of you are going to drink it, and it's a nice, easy, not very time consuming thing. So my first suggestion would be to use a pot. The second would be to buy the tea not from a supermarket, but from a tea store if you can. In whichever, every city in the world will have tea stores. Today it's even easier because you can buy it online from tea store. But even in the past, if you could go to a store which specializes in tea, you would probably be buying better tea. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to buy tea once a month. You can buy tea once in 3 months. It's absolutely fine to have 2 or 3 months worth of tea. And then, just drink it for the next 2-3 months out of a pot. And I think it's a great ritual. And it's possible to do it at home, especially if you are working from home part of the time. And hopefully it'll become more of in India and many other countries in the past, when people would visit office, you would serve them a pot of tea. And that was a very good ritual. I think far better than drinking water from a plastic bottle, is to serve them a pot of tea, and that's all you need to do. It's not complicated.
Fantastic. Well, Rudra, thank you for this overview. Again, we'll include those links in the show notes to both makabari.com as well as luxmitea.in. So you can subscribe there to a tea subscription. Rudra, it was really fun having you on the show. Thanks so much for talking about the tea industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.